Mrs. MACOVEI, you have the floor first then for 1 minute.
No? It's on. Stimați colegi, doresc să vă aduc în atenție situația politică.
Thank you, President. I'd like to point out that the political situation in Romania and the effects of that on relations between Romania and the European institutions. Last October, the Social Democrat Party left the government and then lodged a motion of no confidence in the government, which was then rejected. So we have a position at the moment whereby the Romanian government, given its present shaky formation, cannot comply with its obligations to the EU nor to the IMF in terms of certain sums of money it owes to both bodies. The main party responsible for this is the Social Democratic Party in Romania, which left the government and then refused to cooperate in the formation of a new coalition government. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Alves for 1 minute.
Thank you. Over the last month, the regions of Europe have been involved in the European Year of Regions and Cities. The work of cities and regions is going to be a fundamental part of Europe's contribution to solving global problems and challenges. And here we are grateful to the role played by the European Commission and President Barroso in particular in the hundreds of debates on these issues in the last month. In the conference of heads of region and cities recently, we had for the first time the involvement of MEPs, for which we're very grateful, of course. Working together at European level between towns and cities and regions will make a major contribution to the implementation of European policy and indeed the formulation of European policy in the future. There will be opportunities for us here for us to make progress together in Europe and to make Europe stronger and more effective in many new areas as we seek to respond to global challenges. We look forward to this cooperation between the European Union and its towns, cities and regions continuing, especially in the light of the recent ratification of the Treaty of Lisbon and the importance it attaches to regional cohesion. The next speaker, says the President, is Marian HARKIN for 1 minute.
Madam Chairperson, from 2007 to 2013, €465 million has been allocated to the LEADER funding programme in Ireland. However, just 2 years into the 5-year programme, only 18% of project funding has been spent, because the local development companies who manage these projects have found themselves caught up in red tape and excessive bureaucracy. There are reams of pages of rules accompanied by an extensive inspection procedure. Part of the problem is that the interpretation of the myriad of rules can vary from one inspector to another, and the other part of the problem is that some of these rules are mindless in the first place. One project worker said, "I spend 50% of my time recording what I'm doing in the other 50%. Of course we need accountability, but it has reached a stage where there is now a disincentive for local groups to apply for funding. Millions will go unspent, and if this happens, it will be criminal given the need to kick-start our economies with whatever funding is available. We need common sense in Dublin, and we need to ensure that the EU Commission ensures that this happens."
Thank you. From the Green Group, the next speaker is Mrs. Delli for 1 minute.
Le discours du président.
The speech by President Václav Havel to the Parliament stressed one of the founding principles of the European Union, which is solidarity among human beings. We are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the fall of the shameful Berlin Wall, and in '89 it said humanity would finally be emancipated, with democracy and human rights extending across the planet, bringing down walls and bringing down barriers between people. But for one wall that has fell, how many have been built? Ceuta and Melilla to stop people getting back. War, climate change, detention centres, going from Libya to Lampedusa, where children are shut in the name of returns, building fortresses, building other barriers, even if not walls.
Thank you. I'm sorry, you've exceeded your speaking time. Next speaker is Mr. TOŠENOVSKY from the ECR. 1 minute.
Let po pádu berlínské zdi citlivě vnímáme některé události.
20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we are taking note of certain events happening in the world, particularly in Russia. In the past, we thought that what was happening in Russia was because of ideology. Now it's because of business, and there is increasing nervousness about what is happening with gas supplies from Russia through the Ukraine. The situation differs between the west and east of Europe. We need to do more to work on crisis scenarios. We need to sort out the contractual relations within an international framework, and we have to increase information. The high cost of technical measures oblige us to think about how we can settle these matters now. We need to have bigger storage units and financial resources. We also have to think about getting top politicians involved in the negotiations and what can be left to the market. But at the same time, we should avoid bureaucracy.
Joe Higgins?
Mr. Higgins, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairperson. Today, the EU Commission is demanding of the Irish Government savage cuts in Ireland's budget involving the slashing of public services and the living standards of working people, including even possibly pensioners and the unemployed. The Commission should know, however, that it is conspiring with the Irish Government in a lie to pretend that the money given to bail out the banks is not a state aid while they are hammering the public sector. But however, Irish workers and community activists are fighting back. Tens of thousands marched in protest last Friday. Thousands of workers marched in Dublin today. And on November the 24th, the public sector workers' strike is scheduled to stop these attacks. In view of the seriousness of the situation, that should now be upgraded to a 24-hour general strike to bring down this appalling government, which has no mandate for these policies, and to halt the policy of the Commission and of the Irish Government to slash and burn the living standards and services of working people.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Nuttall from the EFD. 1 minute.
Madam Chairman, I'd like to draw this Assembly's attention to the disastrous effect that the Biocides Directive is having across the UK. This punitive and nonsensical directive bans the use of strychnine, which has been used to control the mole population in the UK for the past 70 years. This was the case until the EU got itself involved. As a result, mole catchers are only allowed to use aluminium phosphate to control the mole population, which costs twice as much as strychnine and has put many of them out of business. But it gets worse. Whereas strychnine kills a mole in up to 15 minutes, aluminium phosphate takes up to 3 days, ensuring that the mole has a slow and painful death. This crazy directive is not only causing job losses across the UK, but it is also cruel and inhumane. And it is another small reason why the UK is better off out.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Tudor for 1 minute.
Doamnelor și domnilor, președintele Organizației Mondiale a atracat Disha.
Thank you, President. In the European Union, we are we have in various countries commissions for the protection of burial sites and of graveyards, protecting them against the abuse of burial places, such as in particular Jewish cemeteries, which should be under public protection. I have seen these violations in my country, including the violation of graves and sites dating back 2,000 years, even though these sites should be subject to public protection and are indeed subject to the protection of United Nations conventions. I have visited Auschwitz myself, which makes the situation all the more acute for me. I think it's important that cemeteries of all religions should be protected throughout the European Union.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. János Ádér for 1 minute.
Kommen Sie bitte zum Schluss. Wir haben alle nur 1 Minute hier zum Reden. Danke.
Could you please wind up? We all have just 1 minute. Mr. Ádér.
Elnök asszony, köszönöm szépen a szót. Az osztrákok, kedves
Thank you for the floor. The Austrians, our fine neighbours, are polluting one of Hungary's most lovely rivers, the Rava. 2 weeks ago, we could see a layer of pollution, and I took a sample of it, but it's not enough for our dear neighbours to be polluting this river, but they would like to have a mill built 300 yards from the border to incinerate waste. It's a waste incineration plant, and this is an investment which rides roughshod over EU directives, and I would simply urge the European Union not to permit this.
Thank you. Mr. Alvenis for 1 minute.
Arsenis? Mr. Arsenis?
Ευχαριστώ πολύ, κυρία Πρόεδρε. Η μεγάλη πρόκληση της ανθρωπότητας απέναντι στην κλιματική...
Climate change is a disaster, and particularly the increase in CO2 emissions. We want to do something for the next 50 years, and we can only hope that something will be done. If we really want to achieve our targets, then we have to take stock of what is happening now. Hectares of land are being destroyed and drinking water is being polluted. We also see this happening in Greece, next to the capital. We need legislation, and we have to do something about deforestation as well. The Council, of course, has provided financial resources, but nothing is done, for example, on deforestation in the European Union. Our forest systems in the European Union, particularly in the south, are in jeopardy. The speaker is cut off.
Thank you. Mr. Ugias now for 1 minute, and then Mrs. Rivasi.
La nostra discussione sulle malattie.
Thank you. After the neurodegenerative diseases debate, I'd like to raise multiple lateral sclerosis and to advert the Parliament to the fact that in Italy at the moment 150 people have started hunger strike in solidarity with a sanatorium that had to close because of the problems of people suffering from this awful disease, and this was supported by national MPs Nicola Rinaldi and Farini as well. These are people who were silently and in a dignified way, suffering from this awful disease. This affects young people, and there's no cure for this sclerosis, but the Italian state is very close to a lot of problems, except for the problems of sclerosis patients and their families. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Rivasi, for 1 minute now.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Moi, je voudrais...
Thank you, President. I'd like to talk about vaccinations against the H1N1 virus. At the moment, a vaccination campaign is going on against H1N1 in the Parliament and indeed throughout Europe, but there are certain risks and benefits involved in this vaccination. The thing is, this virus doesn't in fact lead to a great many fatalities, in fact far less than in the case of seasonal flu. Given that there are risks in this vaccination, we do have, I think, time to think about these vaccinations, and the interesting thing is to look at the additives. And I think we should note that in the United States, squalene has been prohibited from being used as one of the additives, whereas the European Medicines Agency has authorised this additive, squalene, in most of our vaccines. And also the European Medicines Agency has confirmed that there have been no clinical studies done on children and pregnant women with respect to these vaccinations. And they were saying that the results from America, the information from America, is based on extrapolation from prototype vaccines. So I think we need more information. Next speaker, Mr. Piotrowski, for 1 minute, and then Mrs. Figueiredo.
Thank you, Madam President. The decision of the Human Rights Tribunal is a scandal. To remove a crucifix from an Italian school and pay 5,000 euros for moral damages to a student, that caused an outrage not only in Italy but also elsewhere. It is a symbol of our religion here in Europe. Now, removing it is a first step to a cultural harakiri in Europe. Unfortunately, such practices are a part of a plan to fight European values. Let me remind you of the removal of the reference to Christianism in EU's most important documents. We must go back to our roots, to the concepts of the founding fathers who were Christian Democrats. Therefore, I appeal to the President of the European Parliament to organize a debate ending with a resolution of freedom of religious practices in Europe and on fundamental values on which the Europe is based.
Thank you. 1 minute now for Mrs. Figueiredo. Mrs. Figueiredo. Thank you, President. In Portugal, the economic and social crisis is particularly acute in the north of the country, and unemployment is on the increase, making the north of Portugal one of the poorest regions in the European Union, as recent Eurostat documents will prove. A great number of companies are now doing far less work and doing away with a great number of jobs. If you look at Vila do Conde, for example, more than 600 jobs have been lost in that small town in the last year, and the figure could rise to 1,000 by the end of the year. Also, in the same region, one of the major companies is about to disappear. This is not a situation we can accept. It's unacceptable that neither the Commission nor the Council have come up with alternatives to allowing this particular industrial sector, which is microchips and nanotechnology, to be dismantled in various parts of the European Union, especially the poor ones, such as northern Portugal. Thank you.
Dankeschön. Herr Bafton, für eine Minute.
Mr. Bafton, for 1 minute, and then Mrs. Morvai for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. I was due to talk about the pressures unlimited EU migration is putting on the UK. Forgive me for raising a pressing matter recently brought to my attention. As a coordinator on the Regional Development Committee and MEP for Wales, it was with great concern that I received a leaked copy of a draft communication of the European Commission, A Reform Agenda for a Global Europe, Reforming the Budget, Changing Europe. The document proposes a major refocusing of the EU spending priorities, with more emphasis on, and I paraphrase, a global Europe, with less emphasis on agriculture and transfers towards well-off regions. This will have a huge impact on British agriculture and structural fund programmes in this current cycle. As a net contributor, the United Kingdom will be forced to give up much more of the rebate, whilst other countries will be the main beneficiaries. 11.8% of funds earmarked for the UK under cohesion policy go to the poorest regions in Wales. I am very concerned that this leaked document may have consequences for transitional payments at the end of the current programme 2013. It is time the people of the UK have a referendum on its relationship with this place, so they can be the people who decide the destiny, not unelected bureaucrats.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mrs. Morvai for 1 minute.
Köszönöm szépen. Amikor olyan lelkesen ünnepeljük.
Thank you. In the European Union, we have celebrated with great joy the fall of the Berlin Wall, but I think we need to think about what has happened to former communists in these countries. I'll tell you what happened with them. They have got back into power, and they have done away with everything to do with socialism, the good aspects of it, social security and security of employment. But on the other hand, they also did away the brutality and the terror of those regimes. When we celebrate the 56th revolution in Budapest, on that day where we celebrated the fall of communism, 16 former communist comrades are in prison. I will be celebrating when they are freed again and when these old communists will disappear.
Next speaker, Mr. Kalinowski for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to speak on the proposed reform of European budget after 2013. Is it true that the proposal aims for reducing regional funds? Is the European Commission aware that this will weaken our agricultural policy? To weaken poor regions to fight climate change, it's not very logical. This would affect the majority of 271 European regions. We can assist poor regions and at the same time fight climate change, cut emissions, introduce renewable energy and new technologies. By implementing this reform, is the Commission going to bypass local authorities in the implementation? In that way, they are deprived of their instruments on important issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mrs. Blinkevičiūtė, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. The European Union has committed itself to developing an effective mechanism in order to prevent sexual violation against children. 8 months ago, the European Parliament in its plenary session debated this particularly important and sensitive issue. We can only welcome the fact that a draft directive aiming at improving legislation in this area has already reached the Council. However, life goes on, and we're reminded every now and then by horrible news of yet another crime against our children. The consequences of these crimes are devastating and long-lasting. That's why we need to do everything to prevent them. These crimes are usually international, transnational. They don't know any borders. That's why we need to improve international cooperation. We should also remember that there are new forms of sexual exploitation and sexual violence against children, and that's why we should do something about it. That's why I would like to draw your attention to this problem and encourage the Council to speed up the debate.
Our colleague Kacin for 1 minute.
Predsednica, vesel sem napredka v odnosih in zrelosti vlad Hrvaške in Slovenije, ki sta zmogli.
Thank you. looking at relations between Slovenia and Croatia, there's been a lot of progress with the border agreement, which presages well for the future, but sadly the Croat government has also signed a unilateral declaration that really threatens everything and doesn't allow progress in the future. This is not a positive development in that they don't improve the credibility or one's trust in them, and they create a system with different yardsticks. So we must commit ourselves to try to increase trust throughout this region, and Croatia must therefore abstain from unilateral activity and has to show political courage to overcome barriers facing it.
Mr. Migalski, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to point out that last week we were informed of an alarming situation, given that President Putin, Prime Minister Putin, asked the European Commission to pay the debt of the Ukraine towards Gazprom. My question is the following. Has the Commission really received such a request? Is the Commission really going to have the European Union pay the debt? And if the answers are yes to my first two questions, then what would be the basis for doing so? And I would like you to note that I'm the only one that has not used the entire time we had. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mr. Triantafyllidis, 1 minute.
I have asked for the floor today to inform you of a rather disturbing fact that has come to my knowledge whilst on a visit to Washington, D.C. as part of the LIBE delegation. On the margins of the current transatlantic negotiations on data protection, SWIFT, PNR, the United States is expanding its National Security Agency data collecting facilities so as to intercept every electronic message within its territory, as well as all messages coming in and out of the country. How can the US pretend to respect the right to privacy when it is building an enormous eavesdropping agency? And how can we just sit on the side seats and let that happen? It is our responsibility to raise awareness on this gross abuse of power and violation of our basic rights. I hope you will join me in informing our voters and the citizens in our countries about this through declarations and articles to the press. Thank you.
Vielen Dank auch für
Thank you. Bang on time, thank you. Next speaker, Mr. Griffin, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. In the last 2 months, I have suffered victimisation by the UK Labour regime, including withdrawal of my House of Commons pass, refusal to allow me to enter the Sellafield nuclear processing plant despite my position on an ENVI committee, refusal of the Citizens Advice Bureau to sell me an information database openly advertised for sale to all other MEPs. Madam President, would you agree that political discrimination is not only unlawful, but is also an attack not just on me, but also on the functionality of this place, and most important of all, on the voters and the entire democratic process? 40 seconds.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mrs. Torreira, for 1 minute.
Senhora Presidente, inquérito promovido pela...
Thank you, President. A report from the European Agency for Health and Safety in the Workplace has produced some results which give us cause for concern. There were 27 inquiries and questionnaires sent out throughout the European Union, and people on the whole thought that the economic crisis was affecting their working conditions, and that more than half of them thought that the crisis and the deterioration of working conditions could lead to a deterioration in their health. There is an increasing number of people who feel they're exposed to risk. There were 5 Portuguese workers killed in the workplace this week in Andorra. And I think this is just a reflection, one reflection of the deterioration of working conditions because companies are making cuts at the expense of workers' safety. Thank you. Thank you, says the President. Sorry, there was some confusion with the microphone there. I should have given the floor to Mr. Teixeira. There was some confusion. Mr. Teixeira now has the floor. Thank you, President. The European Communication just published a draft communication on the new draft budget saying that the cohesion policy was causing it concern still, especially with respect to the ultra-peripheral regions. Now, of course, the European budget is supposed to be based on solidarity and territorial cohesion, but there are continuing difficulties in giving adequate financial assistance to the ultra-peripheral regions. There are industries in these regions with high value added, which do deserve more support from the European Union. These funds need to be better structured and better channeled to the ultra-peripheral regions to make sure that they do properly benefit from them. Also, we have to ensure that all member states are given equal treatment according to Article 299 of the treaty and not just the newer member states. Thank you. Thank you, says the President. Mrs. Grelier now for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. As a member for Normandy, I'd like to draw the Parliament's attention to the OFSI project that the French government has just submitted to the European Commission. It excludes the dike near Etretat but extends the limit to 12 nautical miles. It will mean that there will be a wind park off Fécamp, even though that the local population has been opposed to this. This has been established as being a coherent and scientifically founded plan. So what is the Commission's view on zoning? These proposals are being made even though they're against scientific evidence and the views of the population. With the upcoming Copenhagen summit, can Europe do something to really promote renewable energy?
Thank you. Next speaker, Mrs. McAvey for 1 minute.
I was the first one.
I can say it again.
Sorry, Mrs. Lukaczewska for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to speak about the health situation in the Ukraine. According to the information we have, there are over 1 million cases of flu, including several dozens of swine flu cases. The Ukraine asked for international help for materials to be sent and for practical assistance. We know that the European Commission has started their assistance with a monitoring center with special instrument and mechanism that coordinate the help and assistance provided by EU member states. What is the situation with respect to the assistance granted? These are the questions to which the European public would like to have answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mr. Pagnot, 1 minute. Not here. Then Mr. Vaughan, is it?
Auch nicht mehr anwesend.
Not here. Mr. Gresh.
Gut, dann sind...
Also not here. Mrs. Gál. Mrs. Kinga Gál.
Bitte sehr.
Hier. Danke. Tisztelt elnök asszony, képviselőtársaim! 2 évtized telt azóta, hogy a berlini fal leomlott, aminek...
Thank you. It is 20 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and we've already celebrated the disappearance of the Iron Curtain, and the 20 years haven't been enough to see these old socialist countries going back to their bad old habits. They certainly haven't left these behind in Budapest as well. A lot of people are trying to get their rights respected, and for people to slander the Prime Minister has led to jail sentences. For instance, someone born there, if belonging to a minority, won't have his or her rights guaranteed, that's for sure. And a former general as well ended up in prison for the same reason.
Thank you, Mr. Fernandez. Mr. Fernandez, are you here? President, the current economic crisis is leading to a situation in which employment is increasingly precarious. And often workers are obliged to carry on working or to accept jobs which are not safe or not in line with working conditions legislation. At the same time, though, of course, jobs continue to disappear, and this is affecting, of course, not only European citizens but also non-European citizens living in the European Union. Also, we have an abnormally high death rate of emigrant workers, both non-European but especially Portuguese workers in Europe, due to a deterioration in working conditions. This applies especially in the building industry. So I would call on the European Union and all the member states to look closely at this situation with a view to bringing about an improvement. Thank you, says the President. Mrs. Auconie is the next speaker.
Madame la Présidente, chers collègues,
President, colleagues, I would like to ring the warning bell about the low level of programming and payments from the regional social and cohesion fund, having programmed less than half of the money out of the 347 millions. Only half have been paid throughout all countries. Spain, Luxembourg and Sweden have to do their utmost to catch up with the countries that are in the lead of payments into funds, such as the Baltic countries and Slovenia. This is a very useful fund for our citizens. It allows for social and regional cohesion through the funding of specific vital projects. So I would suggest that national management authorities be mobilized, because it's vital that in an economic crisis Europe's rules meet the problem. Mr. Sonik.
Thank you, Madam President. We celebrated today the 20th anniversary of democratic changes in Central Eastern Europe. It was a great ceremony with the presence of President Havel, of President Buzek, the celebrations in the Parliament. I think it's the right thing, but European institutions should not only limit themselves to such events once in many years. The historic presence and the true information of those changes should be present in education. It should be inspired by European institutions. We need a common history book, a textbook covering those times, showing how Europe was united, so that our children, when they're instructed at school, they can get to know this truth, reach this knowledge, because there are many cases of money being spent with no reason. The British organization Open Europe says that €7 million was spent on financing a blog of a donkey traveling over the Netherlands. I think it's high time we spent money more efficiently in Europe.
Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you won't be pleased, but according to Rule 44 of our rules, we now have to conclude this 1-minute speeches session. Rule 150 says we are only allowed to have 1-minute speeches for a period of 30 minutes. We've now had 1-minute speeches for 40 minutes because, unfortunately, time and again, we had speakers who did not speak to their 1-minute speaking time. I tried to give priority to speakers who had not spoken in the previous 2 debates, and I hope that you all have the feeling that I took a more or less fair approach. We still have 4 debates ahead of us this evening, and we have to conclude this session at the very latest at midnight. Thank you very much. Now, next agenda item, Mrs. Fajon's report on the list of third country nationals subject to or exempt from a visa requirement when crossing internal borders. I'd like to give the floor right away to the rapporteur.
Hvala, gospa predsedujoča, kolegice in kolegi, spoštovani podpredsednik Evropske komisije.
Thank you. Honourable colleagues, Vice President of the Commission Barrot. The European Parliament is very firm in defending exemption from visa for all the Balkan countries. That's the underlying idea of the report, and I would like to thank the shadow rapporteurs and all members who have helped to achieve the result. I'd also like to thank the Commission and Council for their close cooperation. This work is going to be a good basis for the future, given that implementation of the Lisbon Treaty will allow Parliament to have co-decision on this subject. The Western Balkans countries have less rights now than they had when Yugoslavia was there for free movement. That they're obtaining information via TV from the United States. I'm Slovene, but in 2008, 5 years after signing the Salonika Agenda, giving hope for European entry to those countries, the liberalisation process here is still to be got underway for visas for Macedonia and Montenegro, and it was a Slovene initiative supported by the member states that made sure that citizens of those countries could freely move within Schengen from the 19th of December last. On the 1st of January 2010, we do have a difficult deadline to meet, in fact. We are aware that a lot of citizens from that region go to Europe to visit their relations, and they will need the provisions. And this measure will be required to overcome